Shalom Talmidim. Shalom Hadabarniks. Good to have you back for our next session in the 12 Minor Prophets. We are currently session 9 of the book of Hosea, working through material supplied by Ariel Ministries. So let's review session 8 real quickly, just some of the key portions of session 8. We started session 8 by finishing up chapter 5, verse 15, in which we learned that God would go away. He would return to his place until Israel earnestly sought his face. Then we moved into chapter 6. We moved from the time of the Messiah's first coming. So Yeshua left Israel at the ascension. He returned to his place at the ascension to sit down at the right hand of God. So verse 15 takes place there at the ascension in 30 A.D. But then we jump in chapter 6, verse 1. We jump thousands of years to the end of the tribulation period, where Israel does begin to call upon the Lord. We call upon him because we are surrounded by the Antichrist's armies at Basra or Petra. And the siege of Basra has been going on for 3.5 years, and it appears that it's going to succeed. And so finally our stubborn will is broken, and we call out for Yeshua to return during the last 3 days of the tribulation. And on that third day, that last day of the tribulation, he does return. He does return and save his people. And the initial point of his second coming is Basra in Edom, southern Jordan. But then the whole tenor of the book changes in the chapter. Or I should say the whole tenor of the chapter changes. God laments and criticizes Israel's loyalty. Israel's loyalty is like a morning mist. And here's a picture of mist on a beautiful lake burning away from the bright summer sun warming up the lake. And here's another picture of that same idea, this tree photographed through the mist that is dissipating due to the warmth of the sun causing it to rise. Well, that's Israel's loyalty. It dissipates. It's only temporary. And then my theme application chart summarizes the final part of chapter 6. Israel's backsliding and inability to repent is the theme of the application chart. The application: Israel was very religious. They practiced all kinds of religious observances, but they didn't know God. That was in Hosea's day, that was in Yeshua's day, and it is true today. This will continue until Israel earnestly seeks God. When they earnestly seek God, they will be calling for Yeshua, the Messiah, to return. Then God will heal the nation. He'll heal with the second coming. So after finishing up chapter 6, we then moved into chapter 7, which was a jump all the way back to 781 BC in the prophet's present time. Israel was described as a silly dove. God's going into the reasons why he has to bring the Assyrian judgment in 722. Israel is a silly dove, for example. She has a disastrous foreign policy, fluttering back and forth between Assyria and Egypt, looking for alliances between these countries. And when the alliance is not satisfactory, they break the alliance and go to the other country. So back and forth, like a silly dove, open and exposed. And so God says, since you are a silly dove, you will be caught. I will catch you like a bird in a net. And here's a picture of a pitiful little bird caught in a net. That's the state that is a picture of Israel's state when God judges her. Then we moved into now we move into chapter 8, and we move to the actual Assyrian invasion in 722 BC. Chapter 8, verse 1 to chapter 11, verse 7. All right, so let's begin with chapter 8, verse 1. We begin with the call of the trumpet of judgment. This is the result of Israel's disastrous domestic and foreign policies. The trumpet of judgment, 5 points. First trumpet of judgment against the covenant breakers in chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. The call comes in verse 1, first part of verse 1. Put the trumpet to your lips. Like an eagle, the enemy comes against the house of the Lord. So Israel is told to put a shofar to her lips. Now, a shofar is the horn of a kosher animal. that's been hollowed out and turned into a musical instrument. And you can get a good number of notes out of a shofar. They come in various sizes and colors, large and small. But the shofar, blowing the shofar, is a very, very important part of the Bible and of Jewish life. For example, we heard a shofar blast at Sinai when God gave us the law. The shofar is blown at the New Moon Festival, at Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, during the Jubilee. Whenever we praise God, it's appropriate to blow the shofar. And the shofar is blown in civil affairs and military affairs. So it's a very, very important feature of the Bible and of the Jewish culture. So blow the shofar. And the enemy comes as an eagle. This is a warning to the northern kingdom. Coming as an eagle is a figure of speech for swiftness, like an eagle flies and pounces upon its prey quickly. So Assyria is coming for the northern kingdom. And the enemy is coming against the house of the Lord. Now, this is not a reference to the temple. This is a reference to the nation in this context, because there was no legitimate temple in the north that this could refer to. No legitimate temples. There was a false temple, and we'll see that in a little bit. But the point of this is that positionally, Israel is always God's people. Israel is always the house of the Lord. But experientially, if we disobey, we suffer discipline. Disobedience brings discipline. So the enemy is coming against the house of the Lord, against the northern kingdom. And the reason, second part of verse 1, because they have transgressed my covenant, rebelled against my law. So they've broken the Mosaic covenant and God's law, the Torah. These are all synonymous terms. The covenant has been broken. And so the curses of the covenant are now in effect. But Israel cries out with a false cry in verse 2. They cry out to me, my God, we of Israel know you. So there's a claim of knowledge of God, but it's a false claim, because over and over and over again, Hosea, God, through Hosea, has stated that Israel does not know him. Israel does not know God, even though the claim of knowledge is there. And this reminds me of what happened in the days of Yeshua, and it's still true today, by the way. It reminds me of what happened in the days of Yeshua. John chapter 8, verse 54 and 55. Yeshua answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. There's the claim. There's the claim. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is our God. And how does Yeshua respond to that claim? And you have not come to know him. See, the claim is a false claim. Just like in Hosea's day, Yeshua's day, same claim is being made today. Many will say to me on that day, this is Matthew 7, 22 and 23, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? There it is. There's a claim again. A false claim. The response of the Lord. And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me who practice lawlessness. So all their activities, all their religious activities were really lawlessness. And that is true of today, true right up until the second coming. Right up until the second coming. So Israel is in bad shape. This is why we need to reach out to the Jewish people with the knowledge and news that Yeshua, the good news that Yeshua is the Messiah. Well, the proof and the punishment of these statements in verse 3, Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him. So the proof is that Israel has cast off that which is good and proper. That's the proof that Israel lacks knowledge of God. If we had knowledge of God, we wouldn't reject what is good and proper. So the punishment, part of the curses of the covenant, to be pursued by the enemy. In verse 4, we come to trumpet number 2. This trumpet against the illegitimate kings. First part of verse 4. They have set up kings, but not by me. They have appointed princes, but I did not know it. Well, there were many kings in the northern kingdom, but most of these kings gained control by assassination. They did not come to the office out of a result of divine appointment or prophetic sanction. And Most of the kings of the northern kingdom were illegitimate kings then. Only two were legitimate kings. Jehoram the first in 1 Kings 11, and Jehu, 2 Kings 9. They were the only two legitimate kings, and they were both bad kings. Even though they received divine appointment and prophetic sanction, they were both bad kings, unrighteous kings. So that's the second trumpet call. First against the house of the Lord, because they broke the covenant. The second against illegitimate kings. The third one here against idolatry in second part of verse 4 through verse 7. So second part of verse 4, with their silver and gold they have made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. So there's the sin. The sin is the sin of idol worship. Idol worship. The judgment comes in verses 5 through 7. He has rejected your calf, O Samaria. That's the capital city. He has rejected your calf, O Samaria, saying, my anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For from Israel is even this, a craftsman made it. The calf is made by a craftsman. See, it's not a living calf. It's a golden calf. A craftsman made it. So it's not God. If it's made by man, it definitely is not God. Surely the calf of Samaria will be broken to pieces. For they sow the wind, they reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads. It yields no grain. Should it yield, strangers would swallow it up. And so Samaria's golden calf will be destroyed. Now the golden calves of the northern kingdom were not set up in the capital city of Samaria. They were set up at Dan and Bethel. Here's a map of the tribal divisions. And in the center of the northern kingdom there, in the center of West Manasseh, sits Samaria. That town became the capital of the northern kingdom. But again, the Samaria, although Samaria, the government, instituted the golden calves, they did not set up the golden calves in Samaria. They were set up, first of all, in the north, right at the northern boundary in Dan, and then in the south, very close to the boundary with the southern kingdom at Bethel. That's where the golden calves were set up. They were set up there in order to make it easier for the people in the northern kingdom to worship and not have to go all the way to Jerusalem. If they lived in the north, it would be much more convenient just to go to Dan. If they lived in the south, well, why go all the way to Jerusalem? Just stop off at Bethel. See, the northern kingdom wanted to keep people within the boundaries of the northern kingdom. They did not want them influenced by Judah and the southern kingdom. They wanted to keep control over the people. And here's a close-up of Dan. Here's the city of Dan, located in the tribal territory of Naphtali, Asher on the west, East Manasseh on the east. So here's Dan at the very northern end of the country. And not only were a golden calf set up here in Dan, but there was a false temple set up there. Not a legitimate temple, a false temple. And it was a copy of the temple in Jerusalem. And here you can see the foundation stones of the holy place and the Holy of Holies. To the front, you go up those stairs and you would immediately enter the holy room. But then if you went to the back, you would enter the Holy of Holies. So this is that illegitimate temple. And to the left, if you went down the stairs and continued left, you'd quickly run into the site of the altar. This is where the illegitimate altar was set up. And archaeologists have set up this metal frame so that visitors have an idea of how big the altar was and where it was exactly placed. So there's a picture of that illegitimate altar where the golden calf was, and illegitimate temple. All right, back to our map of tribal divisions. Again, in the south was Bethel, and let's go in for a close-up now of Bethel. Here we are. Bethel is in the tribal territory of Benjamin, surrounded by Dan, Ephraim, Gad, Reuben, and the border with the southern kingdom of Judah just south of it, just south of Bethel. So that's where the second golden calf was set up. And by the way, there is an article on the golden calf, page 15 of your Hosea handout. You'll have an article on that. So Samaria's golden calf will be destroyed, and another aspect of the judgment, that the land will not produce. It won't produce the food and sustenance that the people of the northern kingdom need. And again, this is an aspect of the curses of the covenant in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. So this third trumpet call is against idolatry, and it's aimed especially at the sin of the golden calf. Now, this has been a stumbling block to Israel ever since the kingdom split and the 10 tribes became independent of Judah. Now, Jeroboam I set up the very first golden calf, but from then on it was a snare to the northern kingdom, to the house of Israel. Now, at times, Israel would bring in other gods, such as Baal, things like that. And at times, those gods would be thrown out. Baal would be rejected, etc., etc. But the golden calf always remained throughout the northern kingdom's history. And so now, finally, with Assyria, that calf will finally be ground to pieces, destroyed. All right, now let's get to the next call of the trumpet judgment, the fourth trumpet judgment. This is against the alliance with Assyria in verses 8 through 10. Now, the background to this alliance lays in the fact that Israel saw Assyria's growing might and made military alliances against her, first with Syria, and then they attempted to unite with Judah. But Judah would not go along with the scheme, and this is the background for Isaiah chapter 7 through 12. So God speaks against these alliances as though Israel could save herself from the coming Assyrian destruction. So in verse 8, Israel is swallowed up by the nations. Verse 8, Israel is swallowed up. They are now among the nations, diaspora. They are now among the nations like a vessel in which no one delights. And again, one of the curses of the covenant in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26 is dispersion out of the land. Now, why? Why are they now among the nations? They tried to hire Assyria. They tried to hire, against Assyria. Let me say that right. Verse 9, for they have gone up to Assyria. That's the NASB. But the idea here is against Assyria. They have gone up against Assyria like a wild donkey all alone. Ephraim has hired lovers, and that would be Syria. Okay, now this reference to a wild donkey is independent and stubborn and unsubmissive and untamable. That's the behavior of Ephraim, the behavior of the northern kingdom. Now, just to avoid any confusion between Syria and Assyria, let me show you where they're placed on the map. You see a map here. You see Israel on the west, on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and then on the northeast, the northern part of the Fertile Crescent, you see Assyria. So Israel on the west, Assyria on the northeast. Assyria is the nation that is growing in power and strength and will soon dominate the entire Middle East, the Assyrian Empire. Now, in between the two lies the nation of Syria, pretty much in the same location as modern Syria today. And so Israel and Syria allied against Assyria. That's that's the background to Isaiah 7 through 12, chapter 7 through chapter 12. Israel and Syria allied against Assyria. They tried to get Judah into it, but Judah would not go along with the idea. So remember, there's two different countries here. Assyria, the large, powerful one. Syria, much smaller, much less powerful, and much, much closer to Israel. All right, I hope that clears up any confusion between these countries. All right. They formed alliances against Assyria, but the result of this rebellion and alliance will be a decrease in numbers. Verse 10. Even though they hire allies among the nations, now I will gather them up, and they will begin to diminish because of the burden of the king of princes. So the population will be diminished when it's destroyed by Assyria. All right, let's move on to the fifth trumpet of judgment. This is against the altars of sin in verses 11 through 14. The altars of sin have gotten more and more. I should say there have been more and more altars of sin built in verse 11. Since Ephraim has multiplied altars for sin, they have become altars of sinning for him. So the principle here is you reap what you sow. You multiply the altars to perform sin, they become altars of sin for you. So you reap what you sow. Now the only legitimate altar was in Jerusalem, but Israel had many, many altars. And verse 12. Why have they built these altars? Because the law of Moses has been discarded. Verse 12. Though I wrote for him 10,000 precepts of my law, they are regarded as a strange thing. Now there's some discussion about this phrase, 10,000 precepts. We don't know quite how to interpret it. If it's literally 10,000 precepts or 10,000 laws, something like that, this is hyperbole, because in the Mosaic law there's actually only 613. So it could be just hyperbole. God is saying, man, I could write 10,000 laws, and they would regard it as a strange thing. Or this terminology could be translated, great things of my law. Though I wrote for him great things of my law, they are regarded as a strange thing. So it could go either way, but the point is still the same. No matter which way you go, the law of Moses has been discarded, and therefore the sacrifices are unacceptable, first part of verse 13. As for my sacrificial gifts, they sacrifice the flesh and eat it, but the Lord has taken no delight in them. Now Israel was careful to offer many sacrifices. They offered plenty of them, but these sacrifices were not in accordance with the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law was the content of their faith, not something dreamed up, not golden calves, things dreamed up by man. So the result is the judgment of captivity in verse 13, second part of the verse. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish them for their sins. They will return to Egypt. Wait a second, Bob, I thought they were going to go to Assyria. Well, Egypt here seems to have a twofold purpose. This mention of Egypt seems to be a twofold purpose. Here it seems, first of all, it seems to be a symbol of the captivity, which will in the vast majority occur in Assyria. The vast majority of the Jewish people will go to Assyria. And Egypt was the nation's first house of bondage. So this is probably a symbol of this new enslavement. But on the other hand, there's another aspect to it. Many Jewish people did go down to Egypt. They were fleeing the drought and the famine predicted in chapter 4, verse 3. So they left earlier, of course, than the attack by Assyria. But it appears that a number of Jewish people did go down to Egypt. So we have the diaspora in at least two locations. But remember, the vast majority carried away to Assyria. And so Israel has forgotten something. Verse 14, first part of the verse, for Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces. Palaces and temples were built by the northern kingdom. And these buildings became their hope and their security. Then in the second part of verse 14, we get a quick glance at the southern kingdom, a quick glance at Judah. Second part of verse 14. And Judah has multiplied fortified cities, but I will send a fire on its cities, that it may consume its palatial dwellings. So the evidence of Judah forgetting her maker is evidence. The evidence is the building of fortresses. Judah was trusting in her military might rather than trusting in God. And these fortresses, God says, what you're trusting in will be destroyed. Now, we know from history that there were 46 fortified cities in Judah, and all of them were destroyed by Sennacherib, 2 Kings 18:13. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and what? And seized them. Every single one of them was destroyed. Only Jerusalem. Jerusalem alone survived. 2 Kings 19, 32 through 36. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to this city or shoot an arrow there. He will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same he will return. And he shall not come to this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake, for God's own reputation and for the covenant he made with David. That's why he's going to defend the city. And here's how it happened. Verse 35. Then it happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived in Nineveh. So mercy was shown to Judah, as stated in Hosea chapter 1 and Hosea chapter 4. Judah would survive. The northern kingdom of Israel would not. Judah would be disciplined, terribly. But Israel was deported. Israel deported. There was mercy shown to Judah. Now, as we move to our fifth point, and that's chapter 9, as we get into chapter 9, Hosea now directs our attention to the horrible discipline to come, Assyria destroying the northern kingdom. The coming exile in verses 1 through 9, that coming exile Israel will experience the death of joy. You know, a bountiful harvest was a joyful time for an agricultural community, and it was considered a sign of God's favor. But instead of thanking God for a bountiful harvest, they thank idols. And so Israel is guilty of adultery in chapter 9, verse 1. Do not rejoice, O Israel, with exultation like the nations, for you have played the harlot, forsaking your God. You have loved harlot's earnings of every threshing floor. And of course, the harlotry mentioned here is spiritual harlotry, spiritual adultery, going after other gods, idols. So, the one aspect of the discipline to come is that the land will no longer produce. In verse 2, threshing floor and winepress will not feed them, and the new wine will fail them. So this is a description of the stripping of Israel. Remember, we learned earlier that Israel would be stripped, chapter 2. So this is a reiteration of that curse. The land of Israel will be stripped. We also learned that the land would be dried up. So this is the judgment of 4:3, chapter 4, verse 3. So we have the judgment of chapter 2 and chapter 4. And again, these are curses of the Mosaic covenant, for disobedience to the covenant, for breaking the covenant. So the exile to Egypt and Assyria is then brought out in verses 3 through 6. Verse 3, they will not remain in the Lord's land, but Ephraim will return to Egypt, and in Assyria they will eat unclean food. Now, notice who's the true owner of the land of Israel. God is the true owner. It's the Lord's land, and he grants it to whoever he desires. And he granted it to the Jewish people, but God's grant always brings with it responsibility. God's grant always brings with it responsibility. Here's the Abrahamic covenant in short, made up of 3 promises: the land promise, the national promise, the spiritual blessing promise. The 3 promises, all expanded and developed by 3 covenants God made with the Jewish people. By the way, eternal and unconditional covenants, just as the Abrahamic covenant is eternal and unconditional. The land covenant expands and develops the land promise. The national promise is expanded and developed by the Davidic covenant. And the new covenant expands and develops the spiritual blessing promise. And remember, every grant that God graciously bestows on a people comes with responsibility. And if that responsibility is shirked, discipline is experienced. For example, under the new covenant, if we don't live a righteous life as believers in Yeshua, we can be excluded from our assembly, from the church. We can lose our rewards at the bema seat of Yeshua. Under the Davidic covenant and the national promise, there was discipline. David would always have a king to rule upon Jerusalem's throne. But because of Solomon's sin, the kingdom was divided. The southern kingdom and Jerusalem were shown mercy for David's sake, as we've just read. But here's the covenant we're interested in most here, the land promise expanded by the land covenant, and the discipline in the land covenant, temporary dispersion out of the land. They will not dwell in the Lord's land. So dispersion was a discipline of the Mosaic covenant and a discipline of the Abrahamic covenant, the land portion of the Abrahamic covenant. Okay, so Ephraim then would return to Egypt, he says. Ephraim will return to Egypt. Jewish tradition states that many had already fled to Egypt to escape the drought and the famine. So here's our map. There's the northern kingdom. Already, when the drought and the famine hit Israel, many of the people in the northern kingdom went down to Egypt to seek prosperity and safety, all the way down to Egypt. They would escape the drought and the famine in that manner. But they would continue breaking the law because they would eat unclean food in Egypt. That's a fitting punishment for one who forsakes the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law has dietary restrictions. Those restrictions could not be observed in Egypt. So they will not dwell in the Lord's land, and there will be a cessation of festivals, for the temple is gone in verses 4 and 5. They will not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord. Their sacrifices will not please him. Their bread will be like mourners' bread. All who eat of it will be defiled, for their bread will be for themselves alone. He will not enter the house of the Lord. What will you do on the day of the appointed festival and on the day of the feast of the Lord? So there'll be no wine offerings, there'll be no sacrifices, no solemn assemblies like Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. There'll be no feasts of the Lord. Now remember, this is not a reference to the legitimate temple in Jerusalem. Remember, they observed the Mosaic law, but they observed it incorrectly. They built their own temple and practiced false worship and claimed that they were worshiping the Lord and claimed that they knew the Lord. And their false temple will be gone, destroyed by Assyria. See, they did not go south to Jerusalem. The Jewish people in the northern kingdom went to Dan and Bethel. And again, remember, here's that foundation of that illegitimate temple at Dan. You can visit it today, just like these people are doing. You can visit it. You can walk on the holy place and the Holy of Holies. You can go down the stairs and closely observe the location of the altar. This is the illegitimate temple at Dan. In verse 6, they will die in Egypt. For behold, they will go because of destruction. Egypt will gather them up. Memphis will bury them. Weeds will take over their treasures of silver. Thorns will be in their tents. So many of these people will live out their lives and die and be buried in a foreign land. Some of them will be buried in Egypt. Now, Memphis was one of the capital cities of Egypt. It's located right here. It was a major site for burials. So ironically, when they chose to live in Memphis, that's where they will be buried, in one of the burial cities of the Egyptians. In verses 7 through 9, God explains the loss of spiritual discernment. Verse 7, the days of punishment have come. The days of retribution have come. Let Israel know this. The prophet is a fool. The inspired man is demented because of the grossness of your iniquity and because your hostility is so great. So this is the day of visitation and recompense. And Israel will know something. Israel will gain some knowledge of God out of all this. What will they learn? They'll learn about the false prophets. They're shown to be fools. They'll learn that their wickedness was very great. So Israel will finally come to recognize that these events that they're experiencing constitute a judgment from God. It's not just a fluke of history. It's a judgment from God. In verse 8, we saw that the northern kingdom led in enmity against the true prophets and against the house of God. Verse 8, Ephraim was a watchman for my God, a prophet. See, there's a good description. Yet, there's the contrast, yet the snare of a bird catcher is in all his ways. Deceptive. And there's only hostility in the house of his God. So Israel took the forefront in rebellion. But that's not the worst sin. The worst sin was comparable to the sin of Gibeah in verse 9. They have gone deep in depravity, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. Now, Gibeah, the sin of Gibeah, was the most shocking crime during the period of the Judges. It was committed by the tribe of Benjamin. It was the sin of the Levite's concubine in Judges 19. Read Judges 19, and you see the background here. And the sin of the Levite's concubine included three things. They included rape, homosexuality, and murder. And all these things came about because men were doing what they considered right in their own eyes. They were rejecting God and doing what was right in their own eyes, not instead of what's right in God's eyes. But here's the point, point B. Now the northern kingdom is just as sinful as the Benjaminites of Gibeah once were. Since the Benjaminites were punished, how much more then must punishment come? And so Israel's infidelity is the highlight of verses 10 through 17. God begins by referring to the apostasy at Baal Peor in verses 10 through 14. So the desecration of Israel's fruitfulness is described in verse 10. This is a little bit of the history of Israel. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your forefathers as the earliest fruit on the fig trees in its first season. A very positive picture there. But, there's the contrast. But they came to Baal Peor and devoted themselves to shame, and they became as detestable as that which they loved. You see, the grapes and the first ripe figs, they were delicious fruit symbols of what Israel once was, what she once was. And the ArtScroll Tanakh commentary has some nice comments regarding verse 10, regarding Israel's former fruitfulness and how God viewed Israel. The rabbi writes, he's speaking for God here, so this is a bit of a writer's license here. When I first encountered the Jewish nation, they were precious to me like grapes in the desert, and I rejoiced over them like one rejoices over the first ripe fruits, which sprout from his fig tree. Indeed, I was comparable then to one who travels in an arid desert, bereft of fruit or refreshment, and suddenly discovers grapes and figs from which he can partake. In this manner I found the children of Israel in the desert, and I fed them and cared for their needs. They were precious to me like grapes, which is a fruit of great stature, since it's used to make wine, for they carried the stature of their illustrious forefathers. Their charm was further enhanced because I found them in the desert. That is, they followed me unquestioningly into the wilderness, without having any notion of how they would survive. And they were yet more beloved to me, like the first ripe fig, as they were the first and only nation upon whom I placed my name, and in whom I entrusted my service. So at Sinai and the years following, Israel was fruitful and promised to obey, but at Baal Peor, they corrupted themselves with foreign gods. Didn't take very long. Numbers 25, we'll just read verses 1 through 3. While Israel was at Shittim, the people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab, for they invited the people to the sacrifice of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And so Israel joined themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord was angry against Israel. So it didn't take long, and the nation, which was so precious in God's sight, had now desecrated their fruitfulness. And so there'll be punishment coming. Ephraim's double fruitfulness will become fruitless in verses 11 through 14. There's a play on words here. Fruitfulness will become fruitless. Verse 11. As for Ephraim, their glory will fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. So there'll be a decrease in population. There'll be no fruitfulness there. And those that are born, the few that are born will die young in verses 12 and 13. Though they bring up their children, yet I will bereave them until not a man is left. Yes, woe to them indeed when I depart from them. Ephraim, as I have seen, is planted in a pleasant meadow like Tyre, but Ephraim will bring out his children for slaughter. So Ephraim is like the example of prosperous and beautiful Tyre, a Gentile city that now lies in ruins. And so Ephraim will lie in ruins. Verse 14. Give them, O Lord. What will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. So here Hosea interjects his own little curse here. He's really in tune with what the Lord's saying, and so he kind of spits out this little curse. Now Ephraim and Manasseh formed the bulk of the population of the northern kingdom. Ephraim was by far the most dominant tribe, but now the tribe named Double Fruit will become fruitless. The tribe will shrink in size. Its human fruit will be demolished. There will be no abundance. Well, there was apostasy at Baal Peor. Now in verses 15 through 17, there's apostasy at Gilgal, verse 15. All their evil is at Gilgal. Indeed, I came to hate them there. Because of the wickedness of their deeds, I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are rebels. So this is the sin in Gilgal. So Gilgal, like Bethel, was a main center of idolatry. And because of the wickedness, that's the situation. God says, I hate them. That's the result. This is a reference to the Lo Ami period. When they're not my people, it will become not my people. The situation is wicked deeds. The result, I will drive them out. That's parallel with the term Jezreel, scattered. Remember early in the first few chapters of Hosea? Jezreel, scattered. A third situation, they have rebellious princes. The result, I will love them no more. That's a reference to Lo Ruchama, unpitied. So that's the results of the sin at Gilgal. There's also the sin of the result of fruitlessness, 9:16. Ephraim is stricken. Their root is dried up. They will bear no fruit. Even though they bear children, I will slay the precious ones of their womb. So they will have few children, and those that are born will be killed by Assyria. Ephraim will be diminished. They will be cast out in verse 17. My God will cast them away because they have not listened to him. They'll be cast out to Assyria, most prominently. They will be cast out to Assyria. A few will go to Egypt. They will go to Assyria. And this is, again, the curse of the covenant. And notice the wording there. My God, Hosea's God, not the northern kingdom's God. And they will become wanderers among the nations. Verse 17, second part of the verse. They will be wanderers among the nations. Again, a curse of the Mosaic covenant. Well, this brings us to page 17 in your Hosea handouts PDF and our next theme and application chart. We're referring to Hosea chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 17. The theme, Israel will reap the consequences of her past and present sins. The application, God reviews the history of the nation and he finds the northern kingdom lacking. Even though they had external knowledge of God in the Mosaic covenant, the fact of consistent sinning at Baal Peor, Gibeah, and in the present show that they had no internal heart knowledge of God. The claim was false. They claimed to have knowledge of him, but God, who knows our hearts, knew this was not true. They did not bear fruit that evidenced a commitment to God, and as a result, God declares they will bear no fruit at all. They will suffer the consequences of rejecting him. And the nation's plight for the past 2,000 years is ample evidence of the truth of the book of Hosea. The same is true today. We are wanderers among the nations, and that is, we are still wandering among the nations. 50% of us are now back in the land of Israel, praise the Lord for that, but 50% of us are still among the nations. So this is still going on, and it will not be over till the second coming. Well, a specific application. When we point our finger at Israel and we say naughty, 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 naughty Israel, but remember, when you point your finger at Israel, you got 3 fingers pointing back at you. So let's learn something from this. Let's just pause for a moment and try to see how this can apply to us. What can we learn from this? Under my specific application, I wrote, if God reviewed our lives, would he find us lacking? Would he see us committing the same sins again and again and again, just like the northern kingdom was doing? We may go to church, we may have a theology degree, but all of this simply external knowledge. This is external knowledge of God and not internal commitment to him. Anyone can walk into a church. Anyone can get a theology degree. That doesn't mean you have any internal commitment to him. And eventually, depending on external knowledge, will ruin our walk with the Lord. We will bear no fruit for God. We'll live a defeated life. So the question, perhaps there's an area of your life, my life, our life, where we really struggle. We really struggle with this area again and again and again and again. Okay? If that's your situation today, note it. Note that area in your life. Learn from the past. Stop repeating it. Think of a plan of action that you can put together. Put together a plan of action so you can get on the other side of the equation. Under plan of action I've written, the converse of this is also true. Responding to God brings fruit into your life. What could you do to turn things around in your area of struggle? What can you do to get on the other side of the equation? Instead of being on the defeated side of the equation, to be on the triumphant side of the equation. If God has touched your heart and you see your life paralleling the life of the northern kingdom back in Hosea's day, and you want to get out of that rut, that sinful rut that you're in, why don't you just pause the video, sit down and pray, and write down a plan of action, something practical you could do to cooperate with God, to turn around this area of your struggle. And then hold it up to him and pray and say, Lord, help me to follow through. He may use your plan of action in its entirety. He may give you a new plan of action. If your plan of action is not effective, he may give you a brand new plan of action. And he may bring people into your life to support you in all this. But the point is to respond to God. Turn to him. Seek him out. This is the opposite of what the northern kingdom did. They did not seek out God, especially when times were tough. They didn't seek him out. So times may be tough in your life. Seek out God. Ask him to bear fruit in your life. Cling to him. That's what Yeshua said. We can't bear fruit unless we abide in him, unless we remain in him, unless we cling to him. That's the idea here. It's the same idea that I'm trying to put forward here. Hosea warned against. The nation did not cling to God. And so instead of being fruitful, they became fruitless. All right. I'm preaching now, aren't I? All right. If you want to pause the video, just go ahead and pause it after you've done your plan of action and spend a few moments praying to God. Turn the play button back on, and I'll be right here. I'll still be here, okay? I'll still be here. Okay. All right. I see we've got about 10 minutes left. So let's go ahead and move into the beginning of chapter 10. Now at this point, I'd like to just quickly review where we've been. Before we get into chapter 10, let me just quickly review where we've been. The book of Hosea basically is made up of 3 sections. The message of Hosea's marriage in chapters 1 through 3. the message of Hosea's prophecies in chapter 4 through 14, verse 8, and the conclusion, chapter 14, verse 9. So in chapters 1 through 3, the first section, Israel will be destroyed by Assyria. Israel will go through a long period of time without civil authority, without king and prince, without true worship, ephod and sacrifice, without false worship, sacred stone and idol. But after a long period of time, they will return to the Lord and the kingdom will be established. Then in chapter 4, verses 1 through 19, the sins of Israel which necessitated the coming judgment by Assyria were reviewed. Then in chapters 5 and 6, we covered the judgment and return of Israel. It's a unique section because the judgment mentioned here is not the same judgment that we previously looked at. In this judgment, Judah and Israel suffer together, while in the previous judgment, only one suffered, which was the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom was the one who was dispersed. So we're looking here in chapters 5 and 6 at the Roman destruction, the Roman deportation of the whole nation, which resulted in that long period of time before Israel would return to God and return to the Messiah. And then the Messiah would return to Israel. So in chapter 6 through chapter 10, which we're going to start in just a moment, we're looking at the ripeness of Israel for the judgment of destruction. All right, so let's continue on in chapter 10. We'll go as far as we can in the next 8 or 9 minutes and pick it up in the next section. So the fall of the kingdom is described in verses 1 through 15 of chapter 10. Israel's corrupted fruitfulness is the point of verses 1 through 3. And again, there's that play on words again. Ephraim meaning double fruit, but Ephraim has a vast harvest of rotten fruit. Ephraim is not fruitful. All right, let's take a look at verse 1. Israel is a luxuriant vine. He produces fruit for himself. The more his fruit, the more altars he made. The richer his land, the better he made sacred pillars. So the northern kingdom, Israel, is producing fruit, but that fruit is idolatry. It's not the fruit that God wants. They're multiplying idolatry more and more and more and more. And so there'll be a judgment on this idolatry in verse 2. Their heart is faithless. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their sacred pillars. So this idolatry will be attacked and destroyed. And their king will not be able to help. Surely they will say, we have no king, for we do not revere the Lord. As for the king, what can he do for us? Now the judgment should have opened their eyes, but it didn't. See, the king was not divinely appointed, so that God will not use the king to save them. If it was a divinely appointed king, he would go out with his army and save them, but that's not going to happen now. There'll be retribution on the idol and on the king in verses 8 through 4. And the judgment will be caused by their false covenants, their political alliances. They speak mere words. With worthless oaths they make covenants, and judgment sprouts like poisonous reeds in the furrows of the field. These judgments will be brought about by false covenants. You see, sometimes Israel made alliances with Assyria against Egypt, and sometimes they made alliances with Egypt against Assyria. Remember, Ephraim was a silly dove, fluttering back and forth between Assyria and Egypt. Back and forth between these two countries, never able to come to a decision. So whatever covenant she made with one country ended up broken by herself. She would break the covenant and go to the other country. And because she is characterized by false covenants and she is a covenant breaker, she will be judged in verse 5. That's what happens. The fall of the idols of Beth-aven in verse 5. The inhabitants of Samaria will fear for the calf of Beth-aven. Indeed, its people will mourn for it. Its idolatrous priests will cry over it, over its glory, since it has departed from it. So this judgment coming upon the nation will cause fear among the inhabitants of Samaria. their calf idol. Their gods can't protect them. And again, remember Beth Aven, that's another name for Bethel. The calf was located at Bethel, and it was instigated by the king in Samaria. So their calf idols, set up in the north, set up in the south, Dan and Bethel, Dan and Beth Aven, won't protect them. Their gods won't protect them. And so the mourning of the priests are in mourning because of the destruction of the idols, meant the destruction of their livelihood. And therefore, to Israel's shame, it will be carried away into captivity by King Yareb, whom they tried to hire, verse 6. The thing itself will be carried to Assyria as tribute to King Yareb. Ephraim will be seized with shame, and Israel will be ashamed of its own counsel. Remember that symbolic name, King Yareb? There was no king named Yareb in Assyria, but it's a symbolic name used here again, this time referring to the Assyrian king. And previously it referred to the Antichrist, but in this context it's referring to the Assyrian king, probably Tiglath-Pileser III in this particular context. And so Israel's king will be destroyed. Your notes say killed, but that word is too strong. The range of meaning of the word there in verse 7 means to be cut off or destroyed or ruined or undone. The last king of the northern kingdom was not literally killed. Verse 7. Samaria will be cut off with her king like a stick on the surface of the water. So that's a good translation. Cut off with her king. And so Samaria and the king is going to be carried away like a stick on the surface of the water. And interesting translations by other versions that give you the same idea of this fast-flowing stream taking the stick away, just sweeping it away. The Kyle and Delitzsch and the Jewish Publication Society, one of their versions says like a splinter on the surface of the water. Another translation says or foam on the surface of the water. But the picture is Assyria carrying away the king like a fast-flowing stream, carrying away foam or a splinter or a stick. And so the cultic center at Beth Aven is destroyed in verse 8. This is Bethel, remember. Also the high places of Aven, the sin of Israel, will be destroyed. Thorn and thistle will grow on their altars. So Bethel will be destroyed, where the golden calf was located. And then in the second part of verse 8, the fear of the people is described. They will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. And this plea is a plea for protection. Hide us, protect us. So the people are afraid, and they're even asking the mountains, or personifying the mountains and asking for protection as they see the Assyrians coming down upon them like a swift eagle. And did you note this is exactly the same terminology that we run into in Luke 23:30 and Revelation 6:16. The mountains, hide us, protect us, fall on us, hide us. Same terminology being used as in those sections of Scripture. All right, well, that brings us to just a couple of minutes to go. And, well, I'll tell you what, let me go ahead and take you a little overtime and finish up chapter 10 here. Now, the example of Israel's sin at Gibeah is brought out in verses 9 through 11. The same hideous sin is mentioned again, the sin of Gibeah in verse 9. From the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. There they stand. Will not the battle against the sons of iniquity overtake them in Gibeah? So the terribleness of the sin is emphasized. Remember, it comprised of murder and homosexuality and rape. And it resulted in a war that reduced the Benjaminites from 26,700 men to a mere 600. Judges 19 and 20. Read Judges 19 and 20. So the same thing's going to happen to the northern kingdom. Tremendous decimation of the population. So if Benjamin is punished, how much more Israel in verse 10? When it is my desire, I will chastise them. See, God's in charge. His timing's the key here. When it is my desire, I will chastise them. And the peoples will be gathered against them when they are bound when they are bound for their double guilt. So Gilgal and Beth-aven, the two major cities of idolatry, will be destroyed. Remember, double fruit. Ephraim has double guilt. Little play on words there. Not double fruit, but double guilt. They'll experience a loss of privilege in verse 11. Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh, but I will come over her fair neck with a yoke, and I will harness Ephraim. Judah will plow. Jacob will harrow for himself. So the picture here is the fact that Israel was the most privileged of the nations. Formerly, they just had to tread the grain. The picture here is of a well-trained, well-treated animal that's not subjected to hard labor. It has no muzzle. It can eat all it could. It would grow fat. It had a good job. It had light work. But now it loses the privilege. And he's going to put a yoke on its neck. And that idiom means Israel is to be ridden and to have a plow and to be worked and muzzled and not free to eat the blessings anymore. Now it's hard work. And then there's that little warning to Judah. Don't think you're going to get off scot-free either, Judah. Don't do what Israel is doing. A little warning to Judah. All right, just a few more verses now. The example of Israel's destruction, a second example, is Beth-arbel. So there's a call to Israel in verse 12. Sow with a view to righteousness. Reap in accordance with kindness. Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord until he comes to rain righteousness on you. So they're supposed to sow righteousness and plow kindness and break up their hard fallow ground. Seek the Lord. And the reason why? So God can desire to drench them with blessings rather than with discipline. And that's true with us today as well. God's desire is to drench us with blessing, not with discipline. But what was Israel's response? Verse 13. You have plowed wickedness, you have reaped injustice, you have eaten the fruit of lies, because you have trusted in your way and in your numerous warriors. So instead of sowing righteousness, they sowed wickedness, they reaped iniquity, they were characterized by lies, trusting in themselves and in their army instead of the Lord. And so their destruction will be like that of Beth-arbel. Verse 14. Verse 14. Therefore a tumult will arise among your people, and all your fortresses will be destroyed. As Shalman destroyed Beth-arbel on the day of battle, when mothers were dashed in pieces with their children. Now this reference to Shalman is Shalmaneser the fifth. He was a king of Assyria. When Shalmaneser the fifth of Assyria attacked Beth-arbel, he attacked Beth-arbel after conquering, and he destroyed the people. Mother and children were dashed to pieces. How? By being thrown down from the cliffs of the Arbel. The cliffs of the Arbel are 1,000 feet from top to bottom. The cliffs of the Arbel are located on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Here you see the Sea of Galilee. The cliffs of the Arbel are located in this area here. And here's a view of the cliffs of the Arbel from the Sea of Galilee. You can see the cliff in the red circle there. Let's go in a little closer. Here's a picture I took a little closer. The cliffs of the Arbel. Women and children were tossed off those cliffs by Shalmaneser the fifth. See, up on top of the Arbel, you get a beautiful view of the plain of Gennesaret. 1,000 feet down is the Sea of Galilee and the plain of Gennesaret. So it's quite an amazing place. But can you imagine being shoved off of that cliff by the Assyrian? So now all Israel will suffer a similar destruction. Assyria will not destroy one, but all the cities of Israel. And there'll be no help from Bethel in verse 15. Thus it will be done to you at Bethel because of your great wickedness. At dawn the king of Israel will be completely cut off. So Israel will receive no help from worthless idols at Bethel. Their wickedness will be destroyed. And the king will not be killed, as it says in your outline, because this is the same idea as in chapter 10, verse 7. A better translation would be completely destroyed or completely cut off. And the Art Scroll translates it silence. It's a reference to the capture and imprisonment of Hosea, the last king of the northern kingdom. Remember, he had the same name as our prophet. Hosea. This is in 2 Kings 17, 1 through 23. His ruin is described there, not his death. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 10. I've kept you 4 minutes over, so I apologize for that. I won't make it up to you, though. All right, thanks for being part of this class, and we'll pick it up in the next session we meet. So thanks for coming. Shalom.